Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We're glad to be with you. And today we're Zooming. We're having a Zoom meeting. You guys probably heard of that, right? Zoom. It's a new thing. Like just people are just beginning to discover it. That's obviously tongue-in-cheek. It's probably it's just amazing how Zoom went from being something that maybe just a few people knew about who maybe had to meet across the country for business to something that everybody is using for everything. So I don't know if that's a good thing, but anyway, we're using it, and we're here with you today. But just allow me to introduce myself. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I've been a real estate investor. I've been a professor of philosophy. I've been a contractor, home improvement contractor. I've done some different things, and I'm a writer. I've written some books. Anyway, enough about me. Glenn, tell us about yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're going to be up to. Even though people will get this after the fact, there probably is going to be some recordings and stuff like that people can get to. So anyway, tell us.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of early modern European history at Central Connecticut State University and a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And in a few days, I will be in Moscow, Idaho, sometimes known as either the New Jerusalem or the Promised Land. And there I will be speaking at New St. Andrews for a Reformation lecture. I will be speaking on the origins of Presbyterian polity, that is to say, the Presbyterian system of church government, where it comes from, because pretty much everybody gets that one wrong. They'll also be doing a Reformation banquet, and I will be speaking a little bit after dinner there on the marriages of the Reformers.
Oh, nice. Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. And knowing those guys, everything's going to be recorded and will probably be on YouTube or some other platform. So if you're interested in learning about what Glenn has had to say, then you can, I think they're probably going to either New St. Andrews College or Canon Press. Those would be the two places I think that would be most likely to have something posted. And you've got a book that's coming out, and I imagine you're going to be out there signing it.
I don't actually know if they're going to have copies yet, although they're telling me it will probably be in people's hands somewhere around Election Day, which will already have come and gone by the time this is broadcast. I did find out something really interesting from a friend of mine who pre-ordered it, however. They are giving with this, they're on pre-orders. Sorry, it's too late for this now, I guess, but they're sending him a copy of a treatise by Theodore Beza. Beza was Calvin's successor at Geneva, and it's a treatise on plague.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that's right up your alley, Glenn.
Absolutely delighted.
If it's not resistance, it's plague.
That's right.
Well, great stuff. Well, we're glad for you, Glenn, and we hope you have a great time out there. I'm sure you will. And Tom, tell us about yourself, and it's your day. So why don't you tell us about a class you're offering, and then just take us right into the subject for the day.
Okay, but before I do, Glenn, we do need an updated handbook on the plague. We do need an update on how to live out the faith under those conditions. So it might be right time.
Might be the right time to do that.
Tom Price, a systematic theologian, Christian ethicist, teaching both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I also teach philosophy and other things at many other places. But one of the things that I am up to soon, and actually even when this posts, there will still be a few days to sign up since we pushed the date to give people a little more time to consider the class, is the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network University. They have offered classes with various instructors. They gave me an opportunity to put one out there. So it's going to be one looking at Christianity and theology and culture, but from the perspective of kind of what are the foundations in theological analysis when we go about thinking Christianly about the trends that are around, the way that they're impacting things, and the way that our church is to confront them. So the sort of the side tag for that is something I'm also pondering for a book as well. It's sort of a battle manual for the baptized. And so what does it mean to go to war with the various gods competing for territory that belongs to the one true God, if you will?
That sounds great. Good stuff. Well, anyway, people can sign up for your class, at Fight Laugh Feast Network, right?
That's right. Correct.
Okay. So what are we talking about today, Tom?
Okay. So curiosity.
It killed the cat, didn't it?
That's right. It did kill the cat. And so we're looking maybe at virtue and vice at maybe as a larger category, and then studiousness and curiosity, the virtue of studiousness, the vice of curiosity, basically from the perspective of reflections from some different people throughout Christian theological history, like maybe some insight from Augustine, from Aquinas. I'm actually riffing off of an article by my doctor father, the late John Webster. He wrote an excellent essay, which was sort of summarizing a lot of this content on sort of the Christian understanding of theological intelligence, and the virtues that are attached to it, and then the vices that are temptations for it. And so I want to maybe begin with just the issue of curiosity. There's a kind of...
before you get into it, this is an angle of vision that I don't know anyone has today. I think most people think that there's no such thing as, curiosity in a bad sense.
That's right. And that plays right into, we tend to think of curiosity in the ways in which it's almost a virtue rather than a vice. And so I guess maybe one of the things to keep in mind as we kind of flesh this out is to think maybe of some of the ways we think of it in a good sense. I'll give an example. Think of C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. Should Diggory have rung the bell of charm, right?
Yeah, right.
And the great line in that is, make your choice adventurous, stranger, strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what will have followed if you had. And so we tend to see that as the challenge to pursue the curious, if you will, something that we're curious about, but we're not sure whether we do. Should we take the risk and do it? But I think Lewis is onto something. Curiosity may not be the term that theologians were criticizing when they talked of curiosity. He's more talking about almost that sense of wonder and enchantment that is filled with probably the virtue of what theologians called true studiousness, right? The way in which the desire and appetite to know is ingredient in what it means to be a creature in God's image. And so because of that, knowledge just for maybe pragmatic or practical reasons is not the full picture of why it is we know things. And utilitarian knowing, just merely as a means to some other purpose that kind of helps me negotiate my everyday life. I think what Lewis is onto is that there is something that connects everything to a full, wondrous vision. And if we close the door too soon, we end up stifling all the riches and wonders that we can have as creatures in knowing the plushness of creation and, of course, the Creator. I think that's what Lewis is on to. And I think that's what I think philosophers, when they talk about that first step in wonder, it's like the child. I mean, everything a child experiences for the first time. I mean, watch its gestures and its face. It starts kicking and laughing. And why? Because it realizes it has the gift of being, and it's confronting all of this stuff new, fresh for the first time. And I think what Lewis is on to is that doesn't stop because of the infiniteness of the Creator. There is this plenitude bursting in creation that should continuously drive and order our appetite. But curiosity as a vice is something I think very different, and I'll kind of unpack that. I don't know if you guys want to say anything just in relationship to that, way of making a distinction or not.
Any thoughts, Glenn? I have a couple.
Oh, I'm waiting for the Augustine quote.
Okay. Well, I guess, there are things that I think you could be curious about that are the, sort of the expression of your depravity.
Yeah.
Like, how many ways are there to skin a cat? I mean, the whole idea, particularly if you're talking about doing it while it's alive, right? Just to see what would happen. That kind of curiosity reveals something, malicious about the person who entertains the question. So I guess maybe that's one way of thinking about it, but maybe that's not what you're getting at.
Well, I think that's a part of it, definitely. Glenn, do you have that quote at hand? Because I think it's worth maybe starting from that.
Yeah, well, someone asked Augustine once. In Augustine's day, most people believed that the universe was eternal. It never had a beginning. Mm-hmm. And so one of the attacks that the pagans leveled against Christians that somebody confronted Augustine with was, for all of eternity prior to creation, what was God doing? And his answer was, he was preparing hell for the curious.
Right. That's it.
And I think that's the sense in which John Webster is using curious in that older sense of the word for delving into territory we're not permitted to delve. And I'm going to kind of build that case out the way kind of Webster does, drawing off of these traditions a bit.
Well, before you jump in there, but that very notion, getting back to this idea that people don't have any sense that curiosity could have a downside or actually be, evil or an expression of the fallen nature of a person. That the very idea that there could be, sort of spheres of reality that are off limits to us.
Yeah.
Just it's an offense. It's an offense to the intellect, to the pride, to
yes.
Our pride, that kind of thing. And it's an idea that I think needs to come back, but it's something that hasn't been, presented with any seriousness for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and along with that, you can look at, your analogy of skinning the cat. There are any number of ways in which our depravity can really lead to curiosity combined with depravity can lead to very, very bad places. Just put it that way.
Yeah, and that's where I think the theologians were very attentive,
right? Yeah.
To that theme. And so Webster kind of starts the article out with kind of he is discussing it in the context of Christian theological intelligence, but he draws a lot of parallels to knowing in any sense of the word. And so what he does is he starts with a description of kind of what is the metaphysical and spiritual context in which our intelligent activity takes place. And so he's going to describe it firstly, from the perspective of Christians and the kind of struggle therein, the kind of, and really he talks about Christian theological intelligence or Christian intelligence period takes place. It's exercised in a spiritual situation that is a conflict between the virtue of studiousness and the vice of curiosity. That's sort of how he sets it up. And he kind of fleshes it out. He says, like all human intellectual acts, they take place in this economy of God's reconciling grace, in which ignorance of, in opposition to God, idolatry and the darkened mind, are being overcome by the instruction of word and spirit, right? So here's the fuller Christian vision. But then he says sort of the reconciliation of reason is at one and the same time beyond contest, but it's also unfinished. In other words, in the one hand, Jesus Christ has come. He is the way, the truth, and the life, right? The word is sufficient. Once uttered, it doesn't remove the need for the intelligence to learn and to appropriate the word's inexhaustible fullness. And that's the point of the Spirit of truth has come to guide us into all of the truth, right? So Christians don't just have divine revelation and then it's a completed thing and they don't have to learn anymore. Matter of fact, it's the engine which starts a new principle in the Christian to start that wonder process all over again, right? It activates the reason and intelligence. And so one of the things he wants to contrast between is the difference between what it means to use one's intelligence and reason in a way that fulfills its nature and vocation, in contrast to this notion that the reason and intelligence is nothing more than an act of the will, that it's nothing more than a volitional act rather than having a distinct purpose in God's purposes. And I think that's sort of a criticism of those people who tend to think because the will is fallen, there's nothing that the mind or learning things can actually contribute to our understanding of God. And so we just need to basically restate what Scripture says, rather than thinking through Scripture to become so immersed in the mind of Christ that we are reading reality in fresh and new ways in that light.
Now, there are a couple of things that come to mind when you mention that, Tom. One is, the sort of thing that you hear sometimes people say when junior goes off to seminary.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, there are two sorts of things that, kind of are anti-intellectual in character, but they have different ways of it being expressed. So one is, well, my cousin Bobby, he went to that same seminary and he came out an atheist, so you got that. Yeah. And then you got the idea, well, the apostles didn't need that kind of learning, and my Aunt Susie, she knows the Bible backwards and forwards. She didn't need to have any fancy education. So, there's ways in which this sort of, concern or perhaps maybe wounded pride gets expressed when people discourage you from study.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think right there, it's a very important. There's a few points in there that I think are worth addressing in some sense. One is sometimes people are correct. You send someone off and they come back. They go off. A child raised in the church. They come back as a militant leftist soldier ready to sling the head off of the grandparents. So I mean,
I've seen them. I've seen them go to Christian colleges and come back that way.
And I think what you have going on here is Christian colleges, in many cases of the word, are not virtue instillers; they're vice instillers, and they're a good characterization of where this is going. They send you off to basically become curious. Right? Rather than cultivate the kind of virtues that fulfill your natures through grace and allow them to enact themselves to their fullest potential, ultimately partaking of the life of God and community in that light. There's a valid concern. I think the concern is however placed in the wrong place. It's placed in the intellect in academic knowledge rather than the fact that the appetites of desire are not being converted. And this is one of the points of why Webster is saying, and he's drawing off Augustine and Aquinas and the Western tradition in light of St. Paul and Christ, is that this is why the first context of understanding the intellectual life and vocation, yes, we'll talk about its creaturely aspects in vocation, but also the fact that it is taking place in this context where it needs to be converted and reordered. And so the intellect, when it's carrying itself out the right way, is cultivating those virtues given by the truth of Christ and the Spirit, creating a community of cultivating those virtues, in such a way that the human is in the process of being weaned off of those false gods and idols. This is the battle plan. And then their loves and their insights so ordered the right way towards gods and creatures that they are not in those unhealthy relationships of curiosity, but are actually living in the proper relation you're supposed to have with the rest of creation. So that's the first thing. I think in many cases, even Christian colleges have lost the spiritual context that proper virtuous learning is to be carried out in this fuller spiritual vision, that we are to be putting off. We can't separate it from true religion. We can't separate it from putting off vice, putting on virtue.
Yeah, I had a friend years ago who was the pastor of a church that was a college church on a Christian on the campus of a Christian college. And I remember him one time saying he likened some of the professors at the school to insects who implant their eggs in the bodies of their victims. And so, these eggs, hatch eventually and consume the person from the inside out.
Interesting.
I think he was quite frustrated with
yeah.
with having the Christian faith undermined by ostensibly Christian faculty.
Yes. Yeah.
There are multiple things that this is just sort of that this is hitting me on. Just one observation, though. This isn't entirely a new problem.
Yeah.
If you go back to the medieval universities, the first universities, there were a bunch of poets that were known as the Goliards. Goliath, actually. And they've got a whole genre of medieval poetry called Goliardic verse. They were songs. And they featured primarily wine, women, and song. I mean, probably the best known of them was translated into English as, and I quote, "In an alehouse for to die is my resolution. Let wine to my lips be nigh at life's dissolution. That would make the angels cry with glad elocution. Grant drunkard God on high grace and absolution." I mean, this is not a new concept.
Right.
But I'm teaching medieval universities right now, so that's kind of on my mind. But I'm also reading some works by theologians that don't really, there are reasons for this having to do with other things I'm studying at the moment, but they don't really accept the authority of Scripture. They don't accept biblical authors, things like that. And I find myself, as I'm reading these things, I find myself wondering on some level, what's the motivation here? Is it strictly, purely intellectual curiosity that says that, we need to probe this, we can't accept it at face value, that sort of thing? The text evolves over time and so on. And, I can understand some of the intellectual arguments in some specific cases where this is being presented. But I find myself wondering, given how often, even in Christian schools, you get people who believe that it is their intellectual duty to undermine or to question foundational elements of the faith, where is that coming from? And is it actually, if you will, a healthy curiosity that got them there?
Right. Yeah, I kind of liken it to, there's certain things that in any endeavor, study, any intellectual discipline, there are certain things that are givens. So if I'm studying geology, then sort of the ground and the planet and all the layers of rock are givens. In other words, I don't spend a lot of my time trying to prove that they exist. I don't spend a lot of time trying to defend their existence. I don't spend any time trying to sort of entertain the idea that maybe this all is illusory. And, in other words, there are certain things that are givens. Like if I'm in a conversation with you guys, I don't think that you're projections of my mind, although it would be hard for me to demonstrate in any way that would, remove all doubt that you're not. And that's obviously what modern philosophy demonstrates, is that if you get into the kind of skepticism, you can't really know anything. Yeah. And it seems to me that there is some kind of something perverse at work when we have people who are being paid by the church in some way, even if they're in a seminary environment, undermining the very thing that we're all supposed to be interested in knowing more about. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, what you said brought that to mind.
Well, and I'm going to get back to that because I think this is one of the things that comes out, and I hope I could find the quote in the material I prepped a bit, where it talks about almost this notion of trying to be in the know, the elite, the trends, is part of this kind of vice of curiosity. And it is a part of our depravity. We'll get to that the way he kind of presents it. So virtue, the way he kind of simply sets it out, is really something that is consonant with our, the good creaturely reality that we are. So it would be those habits of action maybe on the creaturely level that allow for the positive potential we're endowed with to be realized through the gift of being an agent, right, as a creature. And then spiritually, of course, oftentimes, I know in the Protestant world, because we like to talk of imputation of righteousness, God does it all, we kind of are sheer gift. We oftentimes act like God does everything to the point you do nothing, so you're not saved unto, as they say, good works, and to living out a righteous life, or fulfilling your creaturely natures for that matter. And that's not the case. I mean, the Spirit's leading us, guiding us into truth is that process by which we're weaned off of those vices and cultivating that gift of new life, practices, habits, enactments that truthfully exhibit who we are in Christ. So it isn't works versus grace. This is grace unfolding in the full parameters of its gift into the redemption of creaturely things. But vice is always dependent on a perversion, distortion of a virtue. So it lacks the positive independent reality. So it depends on a virtue to which it is ultimately opposed. So it's a misapplication, a sinful use of our natural powers, if you will, right? So take human sexuality, right? It's fulfillment and committed lifelong marriage to one person of the opposite sex. A vice is anything that takes that and applies it to something it's not ordained and created to find its fulfillment. You could do this with the intellect as well. So the vice of curiosity is basically to be looked at by looking at its basis, dependence on, and then perversion of the virtue of studiousness. And so studiousness, the way Webster and some of the different theologians of the tradition are using it, would include, I believe, what Lewis was up to as what we would now call curiosity. Maybe I'll give a few things to kind of flesh that out a bit. So he says the Christian prohibition of curiosity is sort of a contempt for reason in some sense of the word. It always sees reason basically as, let me back that up. Oftentimes, the way we're presented with the vice of curiosity, even in Christian circles, is that we look at it as a sort of contempt we should have for reason as always being nothing more than the instrument of a fallen will. Reason is the devil's whore, as Luther put it. And so he wants to kind of move away from that and look at what classically the Christian prohibition of curiosity was about. So this is not a position that all reason is basically will at its root. The desire to know is something very different. So curiosity is not nature, but defect. It's the wickedness of intelligence. It's complicity in going where it shouldn't, right? So idolatry, vanity, lying, these are things that try to overwhelm and replace the vocation and nature of creaturely reason.
So what I'm hearing you say then is that if I spend my time trying to figure out how to deceive somebody, if I'm curious to know the best strategy, we're talking about an exercise of reason that's illegitimate.
That's right. That would be in vice. And idolatry similar. I mean, whether it's probing into things we're not supposed to, right? The wrong kind of speculation. Not, or you think of the issue in the garden, right? It's not that we don't have the intelligence to know good and evil, but that we had a prohibition, right? It's probing into something that we're not meant to probe. It's pushing beyond the commanded limit, if you will. And then also in terms of the different vices connected to it, it's a way of gratifying and being satisfied in our self-sufficiency in a perverted kind of way.
But I've got a wrinkle here, and maybe this isn't the right time to deal with it. And if it's not, we could kick it to the end of the discussion. Mm-hmm. But we have places in Scripture where we see people behaving shrewdly.
Yeah.
In other words, we have people. Well, in fact, we got the story of the unjust steward, where Jesus actually commends the guy. He says, "This guy's pretty sharp."
Yeah. Yeah.
You need to be as wise as serpents, but innocent as doves.
Yeah.
Now, how can you be wise as a serpent if you don't have a kind of capacity to imagine? You know what I'm getting at? Behaving in a way that's not entirely, innocent on the surface. So, like when you think about the story of the unjust steward, this is what always throws people in the story: is that you got a guy who behaves very shrewdly. He's lost his job. He's been fired. I don't know why the guy who fired him just didn't say, "You're done right now, go away." But he gives him some time to wrap up affairs, I guess, and then the guy uses that extra time to essentially cancel portions of the debt that's owed to his master. And because he does that, when he's, finally on his own, he's got all these people who are happy that he helped them out. Now, Jesus, in his response, says, in terms of his interpretation of this, he says, let me put it back. Let me step back. The guy who fired the unjust steward commends him in the story. He says, "You were pretty sharp right there, buddy."
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty savvy. And then Jesus says, the children of this world are wiser than the children of light, because and then he presents the story as an example of how that could be the case. And then he says, use your wealth in a similar way to essentially make friends on earth and be welcomed into eternal habitations. Now, this is a very difficult.
Yeah, sure.
It's a very difficult parable. But what comes to my mind is I've known people, and I've actually had this argument presented to me. I've known people who are just so innocent that they're just patsies. They're just easy marks. And then I've had other people who say, because they've known some of those people, well, you need to do a little bit. You need to behave a little bit. You need to not be so scrupulous. You need to go out and have a little fun, do a little, sin a little bit, not get crazy, so that you become a little more sort of savvy when it comes to worldly, conducting yourself in the world. So what would say, John Webster or Augustine say to that? And I'm not trying to be like trying to stump you. It's just kind of comes to mind.
I mean, things that come to mind, and maybe some of those other things will come out even when we unpack some of the other stuff. But I mean, just kind of my initial thoughts on that would be, there is a kind of spiritual naivety and then a spiritual wisdom that are distinct. You think of, Old Testament, the son deceiving the other by putting fur, hairy arms on and talking when they're blind. I mean, this kind of sense that my sons aren't going to do me wrong. This kind of innocent naivety. And I don't think that kind of knowing, if you will, is the full sense of biblical knowing, because I think what Scripture is talking about, and this is what I think Webster talks about, the wider spiritual context of the intellectual vocation, is that it is a process of being weaned off of sin and into the light, if you will. So it's familiar with idolatry, pride, and the like. So it's a kind of knowing that is placed before the holy, if you will. This is why, he's going to get to, like Augustine in a moment, is just merely knowing creaturely things for their own sake. You can know things about them, but there's a form of curiosity there that is separated from studiousness, which will see them in their full eternal light. And this is why, Augustine would call all knowledge that is basically eating the earth, if you will, that was his term, it is basically this way in which we are indulging illusory knowing. And I think Christians can be guilty of that because they are almost blinded in their kind of, maybe their naivety, that they aren't disgustfully sinful like everyone else, to the point they don't understand how sin is at work in them in those levels that I think a true Christian intellectual endeavor and vocation would exhibit at some point. Because it is a knowing all things, a learning that is not ignorant of it, this being part of the process of conversion and renewal. And I think it's a conversion and renewal aspect that would help the Christian be able to understand their depravity and vices in a way that gives them a certain wisdom to know that it can show up everywhere.
Yeah. A couple of ideas that are coming to me, and I'm anticipating to some extent where you're probably going to end up here with Augustine, and that's one of the things we have to keep in mind throughout all of this, and I've been thinking about it right from the start, is the privative nature of evil, which is to say that evil is not a force in and of itself. When people say, did God create evil? No, because evil does not exist. It does not have any ontological status, because what evil is a lack. It's an absence.
Yeah.
And so when you take that idea and then apply it to studiousness, proper studiousness, when it is weaned from its, or when it is moved away from its proper function, its proper end, you get curiosity.
Yeah.
When in all cases, what we're doing is we're taking something that is in fact a virtue and converting it to a vice.
Yes.
Because we are applying it wrong, we're taking it in the wrong direction. Lewis points out in The Great Divorce that the greatest virtues become the greatest vices when they go bad. And so that's one of the kinds of things we're looking at here.
Yes.
The other thing, though, that came to mind is when you talk about knowledge, proper knowledge is not knowledge of the thing in and of itself. It's knowledge of the thing in relationship to God, in relationship to the whole. We're back to the thing that I keep going to, the difference between fact and meaning.
Yeah.
That we're in a world of facts that is completely devoid of meaning, or at least what the culture is telling us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the proper kind of knowing is the kind of knowing that brings understanding or meaning to things rather than just knowledge of fact.
Yeah. And that's why I love Augustine's term, eating the earth. He says it's basically being obsessed with the sign, the signet, but not the race, the thing, in its relation to the divine and ultimately pointing to it as well. And this is not sort of the pan-everythingism, that everything, therefore, the only significance it has is because it's related to God. No, but God is the full light to see its full dignity, which deals with that insight, I think, that helps us to order our relation to it in the right way. And this is part of that weaning off of it as something that gratifies, as eating the earth. and is our source of nutrition, and rather sees it for what it is in its creaturely dignity and its way of manifesting God's glory. But I think that issue of privation is key. I mean, this is another episode of the positive, the intellect, and studiousness being a virtue, and vice being a lack, an evil, a deformation of a good thing. And that's one of the things that sort of Webster highlights, is that we are dealing with, first and foremost, a created nature here. Now, a lot of times, we want to kind of, especially in the Reform world, implode all created natures to the point that there's just a complete creation that had a new creation with no continuity to the resurrection of a body, if you will. And in this case, it's emphasizing that we have intelligence. It's a good gift. It has a distinct vocation in our creaturely life in relation to God and everything else. But it has evil in it, right? It is depraved, if you will. So studiousness and curiosity puts it our active, intelligent relations to that which is not known. I mean, that's where he kind of starts. They're movements of intelligence towards new knowledge, movements drawing their power from the creaturely appetite to acquire knowledge beyond what is required for the satisfaction of the immediate passing needs. But studiousness and curiosity participate in this movement of knowledge in different ways. Studiousness being its well-ordered temporal enactment, curiosity its deformation. And so studiousness is a strenuous application of the powers of the creaturely intellect, the end of which is to come to know something for the first time, or to apprehend something under a new aspect or with new interest in some object already known. And what's peculiar to us as creatures. So one of the things Webster's hitting at here, drawing off of Christianity, is that intellect doesn't start with the spontaneous creation, like Chris was talking about, of the creature. It's caught up in a movement of communication and sign and meaning and reference that we are brought into. And as we're brought into, we're moved by that movement. It is oriented properly towards a well-ordered of our thoughts in congruence with divine purposes and meanings and fulfillment. When it gets deformed, it is a breaking from that. And it is an introduction into that break with a whole bunch of deformities that have basically filled the world of meaning and knowledge and knowing with a bunch of things now that are added to what we have to come up against as people kind of weaning off of that world impacted by the fall.
What comes to my mind at this point is if this way of thinking is recovered, what would it do for the disciplines, broadly speaking, not simply narrowly focused on theology, but just, you could say, and I think we've talked about this before, that every discipline is just applied theology.
Yeah.
We're talking about literature, or if we're talking about geology. I mean, we're just talking about theology sort of making it an approach to the divine mind from a particular angle. So it seems to me that that's kind of
what the medievals meant when they said that theology was the queen of the sciences.
Yeah.
But it was that all of the various sciences could be arranged under theology because all of them are explorations of God's world.
Yeah, they're all actually theology.
Yeah. And I think what happens here, maybe this will help with that question from a different angle, but it may help address it. Is one of the things he starts to hit on is studiousness, the virtue, is a reflective activity, one whose application is subject to the appraisal because it is governed by standards of excellence. And this is something I think that is missing from what you just said, Chris, where most of the academic disciplines, I mean, there can still be some standards of excellence just in terms of, turning in a well-edited, well-written paper, if people still do that. or things like that. But this has to do with intellectual virtues and moral virtues. And this is something that Webster's going to say has been severed off from the academic world, of modernity and its break from Christianity, is that seeing the intellect tied to our intellectual appetite. And this is something he wants to retrieve, this notion of our appetite, of our created desire to know, and its perversion is at the heart of where these vices and virtues get fleshed out. And actually, Paul Griffiths, I don't know if you know him, he was in the news a couple of years ago because he sent a nasty email to, he taught at Duke University.
Oh, this is coming back to me. It's coming back to me.
Yeah. Paul Griffiths. He's funny because if you see him, he looks and talks like Pete Townsend, the guitarist from The Who. And I think they're from the same area. But anyway, he wrote a great book called, let me see if I get the title right. I better look at Intellectual Appetite, a Theological Grammar. And it kind of looks into a lot of this from the Augustinian line, all the things involved in cultivating the intellect properly. But anyway, he must have been on his game because the administrator wanted him to go to another one of these diversity trainings, political correct talks. And he finally said, look, I've dealt with enough of this stuff. It's a waste of my time. So he ended up having, sadly, to resign for that. I think he's at the Catholic. I think he picked something else up afterwards. But he's somebody who surely was not contaminated by vice that morning. He was following virtue.
Right.
Now, another angle on this, going to Augustine, since we're there, is according to Augustine, all true knowledge is mediated through Christ. Yeah. Because Christ is the Logos, but he is also the light of the world, and through light we see things. Light is the physical medium through which we experience most of what we experience in the world. And while Augustine's understanding of how all that works was not quite ours, he nonetheless took very seriously the idea of Christ as the light of the world, making him the one mediator of true knowledge. All true knowledge comes to us through Christ.
Now the question that I think occurs to me, I think most people at this point, is does this require a conscious faith?
Augustine would say no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
there are pagans who have real knowledge.
Right? Yeah. And again, the second part of it would be yes, in the sense that the fuller light that lights everything is known in that process. And Augustine would say putting not eating the earthly as our full nutrition, but eating the heavenly, if you will, the manna from heaven. So that will give us something different. But yeah, there's that chief among the intellectual standards, Webster writes, of excellence is the requirement of studiousness. This is a dedication of our mental powers to relate to the object of study by holding to the integrity of the object, that it's respected as it comes to be known. This is the gift character of what we know. In other words, it's not an imposition of meaning. It's a respecting the integrity. To come to know it is a form of representation of reality, but that representation must accord with that inherent order of the object. And this is that logos that Augustine's talking about. There's an inherent intelligibility, a created nature that is given its meaning and sense in its reference to the creator and then relation to all things. So this shape, this sound, this sequence, this conceptual pattern has its full dignity in place within this way of knowing. And this is why Webster would call true studiousness is in its first sense a contemplative act. It is contemplating the integrity of the object, its inherent ordering, ultimate ends and proximate ends, and the reception of the full gift of the dignity of the object. And I think this is something lost. It's all about making an object, creating an objectivity. You see it now in just regular news cycles. I mean, complete fabrication of language and reference in order to create a narrative, if you will, which is just meant to be a reification of something we know to be false, just for its rhetorical capacity to persuade wills, right?
So let me just kind of interject here something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. and that's the nature of the subject-object relationship within the logos. So, if we think about how people conceive of knowledge, when you don't have this larger framework of the logos, then you've got a subject which perceives an object. Now, the problem is even in that relation, there's kind of be some kind of faith that there's an actual object out there and that it is a gift. It has a gift character to it. Now, if you remove, sort of the Christian frame, it's hard to speak of things as gifts. You just have to be just a very unusual or quirky person to talk about things in that way. But if you have this larger frame, then you can say, okay, these things are presented to me as gifts. But even more, I think, significantly, if getting back to Glenn's point about light, logos, meaning, so forth, if the logos is the thing that sort of works in all things, holds all things together, is the light of the world, then it's operating in both the subject and the object simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So what you have is the subject is recognizing in the object the thing that's in that makes for the whole process of knowledge possible, or the way knowledge works possible, because there's a kind of recognition in the object of what's in the subject.
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm getting at?
Well, and I think this is why, Webster's talking Trinitarians. This is why you have word and spirit, especially in the Reformed tradition, puts such an emphasis on that. It's not just it's not just the objective word, but it's the objective word apprehended not just simply from something without, but a participation in. And this is similar to, I think, the way the classics. I know Aquinas, I know Augustine often talked about knowing as a participation in the object. It's not the other way of the object merely participating in your subjectivity. It's you being invited into its reality. And I said so that there is a breakdown there between subject and object. That this isn't Descartes and all the problems that came after that. I think this is something where there's a much richer intimacy. But between that, because yes, it's the same logos. It's word and spirit are in perfect harmony as one.
That's right. And both the subject and the object are participating in the logos in some sense. So this gets back to Glenn's point about there is no apprehension of any kind of truth apart from the logos, because the logos is the truth.
Yeah.
But then it gets down to this confessional matter. Let me just quickly get to this, because I've known people who confess Christ and are ignorant about many things that they think they know. You've probably come across people like this. It's true for me. But then there are people that don't confess Christ, that in at least a sort of narrow range, I can say he knows what he's talking about. So how do you work with that? Without becoming some kind of universalist or someone who just dismisses the confession of Christ, in faith as non-essential to knowledge. Yeah, that's the troubling thing for me.
Yeah, well, I think what you have on the one hand, I think we can kind of keep things a little distinct and then bring them back together. All human creatures, as creatures, have the endowment of the intellect. And as part of the common gift of creation, that the rain falls on the good and the bad, is the fact that some people have the ability, by grace, a common grace, to know all kinds of things, oftentimes and most of the time, more than a lot of Christians. There isn't a rich array of intellectuals at any particular given point in Christianity. You have highlights. We're still reading Augustine, right? We're not talking, even when I'm talking about as brilliant as John Webster was, he's quoting Augustine, right? So there is this side of things that you don't have. There's nothing. I think John Gershner used to say. He said, "There's nothing great to having a great intellect. There's nothing like saving about it. Right. We can all have it. There is, though, however, that whoever exercises those things as a common gift and grace is doing so under endowments given by the Creator, and their creaturely wisdom is something that creatures the Christian should read and learn from the same way you would when your mechanic tells you to do X, Y, and Z, so you don't have to keep going to the mechanic, right? There is something about that wisdom and knowledge that you want to take seriously, because that person has been endowed with a gift that is able to unfold and know things because of the logos that lights everyone. Does that mean, though, that, that particular intellectual, for example, that tells us can write a brilliant history of Western thought could see it in its fuller light? Okay, this is where the person who may not know that he has a right and left hand may still be able to shed some illuminative wisdom on the topic that the person could never come to in and of himself as just a given natural intellect, right? And that there are going to be idols both in the person who doesn't know the true God, but also have to be weaned off of the Christian who has to continuously bring its thoughts and insights before the knowledge of God in Christ to measure the length and depth of their insight in relation to God. So, I mean, I think what we can say there is that it's not an either or. Either you're regenerate and therefore you have everything, you don't have to study. Or
I've come across those people, and there's some of the most ignorant people I've ever met.
They are, and I think they do, and I think they do a danger. I mean, this is the point about be wise as serpents, gentle as doves. I mean, they do a disservice because they don't discern the times, oftentimes, and they don't really get the advantage of fulfilling their intellectual vocation of knowing, of bringing all things and knowing all things and participating in all things in relationship to their fullness in Christ. So I think what they've done is basically they're happy with, they're happy having the cupcake rather than the whole cake, if you will. And it doesn't mean they don't have a share in that full cake. It just means their share and their experience and their ability to share is, limited to the cake.
And once again, this is not a new problem.
Yeah.
Augustine wrote a book called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis,
right,
in which he discussed exactly this kind of thing. People who contradicted all sciences, the scientists of his day, didn't use that term, but the people who had studied the natural world of his day, and they contradicted it because they read something in the Bible, and that meant that they knew everything that there was to know. And he says, you can't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
This is probably a good point to kind of wrap things up. Believe it or not, we're actually at about the time we normally wrap up. It's kind of gone. It's been kind of a quick talk or a quick discussion. At least it seems so to me, because it's been so interesting.
Yeah.
But you have anything you want to wrap up with, Glenn? That was a great way to sort of bring us in. But is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think it's an interesting conversation, and one that we're undoubtedly going to be coming back to kind of regularly. It touches on a lot of themes we've already talked about, and undoubtedly will continue talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say, Tom, as you bring this into our landing?
I think I'll end with this. Is a lot of times for people who listen to this show, they may see us kind of wander into a lot of territory. And I think a lot of times, I've been trying to think of one of the best ways to put it. It's a combination of thinking Christianly and Christians thinking, right? So on one side, like today, we're trying to do, what is thinking Christianly about this particular thing or that, the intellect, its virtues, its vices, it's obfuscation by sin, and it's illumination by divine light. But on the other hand, we'll have an episode where we completely sound like we're taking it into territory unexplored. Should Christians go there? And I think what we're trying to say is these things can go together, because we're interested more in the studiousness, not the curiosity to enhance pride and enter terrain. And I think this is what's similar to what Lewis is up to with that initial quote, and what the project that Lewis and Tolkien and these other figures were doing. Is they were doing a form of studiousness. They were fulfilling that. And matter of fact, I'll end with this last thing. Lewis writes, he investigates this question in his essay, Christianity and Culture. And in that essay, he's kind of saying, well, is there an advantage? Like, do we get something more spiritually from cultivating, and he's thinking high culture. And he said, well, there are a lot of reasons to think you do, but I can't think of any. Sometimes my Augustinian side wants to say, no, but for a sinner, I'm nothing. And then he does turn it interestingly, but this is my vocation. And in a strange way, he ends up here. The vocation of the intellect is to actually fulfill itself in these territories. I think he meant something more limited, his particular vocation, but I think we could widen it. I think all of our vocations as creatures with an intellect should be doing what we're kind of doing here.
Right. Well, for that, I mean, we went on the last show that one of the things we, at least I hope that we're accomplishing with our show and the different things we do is helping people to be more competent.
Yeah.
And I think, that includes obviously our ability to see, to reason, to behave, wisely. And so hopefully this discussion is, helped to further that. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast. Wanted to say one thing before we wrap up, and that is we are working on our website. We were talking with our tech earlier today, before the show began, about how that's coming along. So hopefully in the near future, we'll have it up and running. We haven't forgot about it. We're just trying to make sure that everything is the way we want it. And Tom and Glenn and I have actually spent a little time providing some content. And so there's some more to work with there. But anyway, that's that. Well, we wish you well, Glenn. Have a safe trip out. I'll be following you in a few days myself. My wife and I are flying out to the West Coast and then up to Moscow the week after you're there for the NSA board meeting. I'm a member of the board, so I'll be able to get some of the thoughts from the guys while I'm out there on how you did.
Okay.
All right. I'll only tell you the good things. I'm sure they'll all be good. But anyway, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast. Bye-bye.
Bye now.